The functions of the urinary system is not just as simple as making urine and getting rid of it. I mean, that is the primary function. It's the removal of metabolic waste. That's really what urine contains. Solid waste, of course, would be in the fecal matter, which is part of the digestive system in terms of getting rid of it. But here is all about filtering blood and getting rid of metabolic waste out of your bodily fluids. In addition to that, you have the regulation of blood volume and blood pressure. Your kidneys actually secrete hormones in response to how much blood is flowing through them, the pressure, either the lack of fluid or too much fluid, and that has an effect on your blood pressure and blood volume. It also regulates plasma concentrations of various electrolytes, various minerals like sodium, potassium, chloride, etc., because it's going to get rid of more of those or less of those through urine, depending on how much you have. And it also helps to stabilize blood pH. In addition to getting rid of stuff like sodium or hanging on to it, hanging on to H plus or getting rid of H plus, these hydrogen ions, that has an effect on pH. In addition, bicarbonate ions, which has an effect on the alkaline levels. So if you know enough about pH, hanging on to this would actually make the blood slightly more acidic. Getting rid of this would actually make the blood slightly more basic. And the normal pH for blood in the human body is 7.4 on the pH scale. That's slightly basic. It also conserves valuable nutrients. You want to hang on to certain things in your bloodstream and not get rid of them, and that comes down to kidney function. So when we look at the different organs and tissues of the urinary system, there are four main players. Here's a little drawing of it. You've got the kidneys, of course. They look like kidney beans. This is the left kidney. This is the right kidney. The left kidney is ever so slightly higher. The right kidney is a little bit lower because of the liver kind of hanging down over it. So, it's normal to be born with two kidneys. There are the ureters, which are these tubes that take recently made urine out of the kidneys to a temporary storage spot known as the urinary bladder. Just calling it the bladder is not sufficient in anatomy because there's also the gallbladder. So you want to specify that this is the urinary bladder. And then the urethra. The urethra is that tube that finally takes urine out of the body. And it is, of course, longer in males, shorter in females. I'll discuss that more later. All right, so when we look at kidneys, these amazing organs that actually make urine, you do have two kidneys on either side of the spine between the thoracic vertebrae at the bottom of the thoracic curvature, so number 12, where your last ribs are found, and down to about the third lumbar vertebra, which means that they're only partially covered by your rib cage. Just the top portion has some ribs going just posterior to it. And your kidneys actually are very much a posterior organ. There's this term kidney shot if someone hits you right back there, right under the rib cage, and that kind of impact could definitely damage kidneys. It happens in contact sports often. But the left kidney is slightly superior, slightly higher to the right one. They are held in place by surrounding connective tissue, and that surrounding connective tissue includes the peritoneum, and it's a nice wrapping around abdominal organs that keeps them in place. And there's other neighboring organs that help keep them in place. They're reddish brown. The reddishness, of course, because of the high blood flow. There's a lot of blood going to your kidneys every second of the day. They're about 10 centimeters long, 5.5 centimeters wide, and about 3 centimeters thick, with a mass of about 150 grams each. So here are the major parts. Let's label these. So the renal cortex. Renal cortex, you see that right here. As with the adrenal glands or any other organ that has the term cortex, that means the superficial outer part of it. So the renal cortex, you're going to see a lot going on in the next few slides in terms of how the filtration process gets started. The renal medulla, or medulla, some people pronounce it that way, that's a bit deeper, just like with the adrenal medulla. So you can see that these little areas that kind of look triangular, that's really where most of the medulla is going on. And those are called renal pyramids because they do look pyramidal, triangular. So here's a renal pyramid, renal pyramid, renal pyramid. So those make up most of that medullary layer in the kidneys. And this is, of course, a cross-section, a frontal section or coronal section through a kidney. From the outside, you would not see the pyramids and, seeing that medulla. So you'd have to cut into it to see them. And then you have these two areas. They're each calyces or calyxes, major and minor. So once you have development of urine, it comes out of the medullary area into what are called minor calyxes, and all of the minor calyxes lead to major calyxes. These are the major calyxes here, and then it goes into what's called the renal pelvis. So the renal pelvis, let me use yellow for the calyxes, and here, these are the calyxes. And then the renal pelvis is this collecting area right in here. And this other term, the hilum, is kind of that exit region of the kidney through which the renal pelvis empties into the ureters. So renal pelvis is actually at the medial side of the kidneys, because the kidneys kind of point towards each other, and the renal pelvises feed into the ureters, which of course then go into the bladder. So blood flow to the kidneys, amazingly, in a healthy individual, over 1 liter of blood flows through the kidneys each minute of your life. That's incredible to think about, because the average person has about 5 liters of blood in their body, or 10 pints. So yeah, it's amazing to think that 20% of that is constantly just there every minute going through your kidneys. So they're doing an amazing job of filtering blood. They receive blood through renal arteries. The term renal always applies to the kidneys. So here's these different parts here. The segmental arteries are right here. So the segmental arteries actually branch off of the major renal artery into the kidney. The interlobar arteries, let me show you those. They actually end up going into each little lobe. So here, 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 here. All of these are interlobar arteries, which branch off of the little segmental arteries here. The arcuate arteries finally take blood branching off of the lobar arteries all the way up to the more superficial cortex regions. So here and so on. You're going to see those arcuate arteries. And then finally, those branch off into these tiny little capillary bundles. You can call them afferent arterioles that lead to the capillary bundles. Because remember, arterioles branch off of arteries, slightly smaller, and then they lead to capillaries. So afferent arterioles, because they're going to these little filtering regions in the kidney, all these up here, these afferent arterioles, get super, super tiny to the point where they're microscopic, and they form little capillary bundles called glomeruli. And you're going to hear more about those on the next few slides. So the afferent arterioles, I'm not going to color code those. Those are all in here in the cortex of the kidney, and they branch off into millions of little bundles of capillaries. So blood leaves through the renal veins. So you have this blue little tube here. The renal veins take blood out of the kidney, the blood that hasn't been filtered out to make urine. And of course, blood flow is going to be regulated by nerves. They're called renal nerves. All right, nephrons, these are the little filtering units of the kidney. This is where all the action happens. So they are microscopic tubular structures in the cortex of the kidneys, at least that's where they begin, that do the filtering of blood and production of urine. Here's a model of what it looks like. Because it's in three-dimensional space, some of the precise arrangement of where these tubes are kind of crisscrossing can vary, and you're going to see that represented in future slides in this lesson, where sometimes this little tubule is actually slightly off to the side over here, but the names are still the same based on the order in which fluid is moving through there. So 1.25 million nephrons per kidney. Wow, amazing to think about. That you're going to have 2.5 million total. Microscopic little amazing filters getting the job done. So first off, the glomerulus. Okay, the glomerulus is this little bundle here. It's a bundle of capillaries, and they go into this little capsule, and then you have certain items, water, ions, etc., moving across into the capsular space, which then leads to these little tubes, these little tubules. So the Bowman's capsule so I'm going to label actually glomerulus. I'm going to check mark there because that's in red. The Bowman's capsule, named after Dr. Bowman, I presume, is this right here. And together, you could call them, together the glomerulus and the capsule around it, a renal corpuscle. So I didn't actually write that, but this thing here, that little box that's describing the interaction between those two, renal corpuscle. So the Bowman's capsule, that leads into this here. That's known as the proximal convoluted tubule. It's twisty-turny, proximal to where this began, and then later it'll be distal, more distant. Proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT. It's this right here. Keeps going, and leads to the loop of Henle. Oh, Henle. Another scientist, I presume. That's what's going on here. So this is the loop of Henle, and there's actually two parts to it. There's the descending limb of the loop, and then there's the ascending limb going back up, and then the distal convoluted tubule. Let's use blue for that one again. So the DCT is a little bit more distant. Here it is, and then eventually we get into some other parts. This is the collecting tube, which has some ducts that lead into what's called a papillary duct, and of course that's going to lead deeper and deeper and deeper into the kidney, and by the time you get down here, it's urine, and that urine collects from all these millions of different nephrons together, going out the ureters to the bladder. So you're going to hear more about that in a few slides. So how does stuff get filtered out of a glomerulus? And plural is glomeruli. So a glomerulus is a bunch of capillaries, of course, and I didn't label this on the last slide, so I'll tell you here. This is the afferent capillary going into here, into what we call the glomerulus, and this would be the efferent one. Just like with nerves going to the brain, out of the brain, efferent neurons, it's the same idea here, afferent to efferent. They are fenestrated, and if you watched the blood vessel lessons previously, a fenestra, that means window. So instead of solute, little microscopic particles having to go through the barriers of these capillary wall cells, they don't just go through the little borders of the cells. They're actually, in each cell, are little holes, essentially, and the fenestrated capillaries make it very easy for stuff to quickly pass through that's small enough to fit through. So blood pressure forces water, because that's small enough, and small solutes across the membrane through the fenestrated capillaries and into the capsular space, the Bowman's capsule here. And some important nutrients like glucose, fatty acids, amino acids, and vitamins can also pass through. You don't want to let go of all those things because, especially if you're low on them at that moment, you need these things in your bloodstream to supply these nutrients to your cells. There is a way to get that stuff back in your bloodstream, which we're going to cover a little bit later. It has to do with them being reabsorbed into the proximal convoluted tubule. The proximal convoluted tubule. So right after we leave the glomerulus and a mixture of water, solutes, and maybe some of those slightly larger organic compounds are coming through here. Here we're now in the proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT. It is the first segment of this renal tubular system, and it's lined with simple cuboidal epithelium. So if you remember back to the tissues lessons, we went over what simple cuboidal epithelium looks like. If you were to take a cross section of the PCT, you would see kind of cube-looking, one cell layer thick cells. And of course, they're all going to have their own little nucleus. So here's that rounded cuboidal epithelium. This would be called the lumen, the space within this tube. And reabsorption of nutrients happens here. And what's meant by that is you have water and solutes coming through here, and that's eventually going to be urine. But at this point, as you go through this tube, you can actually suck out, because of osmosis and diffusion, some of the nutrients, ions, water, and plasma proteins that happen to come in there that you want to hang on to. So as you go through the PCT, you're going to have the release of these items into the paratubular fluid that is around here. Speaking of which, if you were to look at a highly detailed version of this diagram, you would see your venous blood, or just capillaries in general that aren't part of the glomerular complex, just coming around these tubes. And so you can get that stuff back into your bloodstream once it's exited this tubule. And that's good. You don't want to let go of ions that you're low on, or plasma proteins that are important to have. Once you have some of that reabsorption occurring through this PCT, you're going to end up in the loop of Henle. And this is actually under-exaggerated. It should be much longer. Some of these loops go very deep into the medulla of the kidney. So it's found in the medulla area of the kidneys. And like I mentioned before, here is the descending limb and the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. And so what's going on here? Well, you actually have active transport occurring in this section. Earlier, I mentioned how diffusion and osmosis would drive reabsorption here. That's a passive process, but active transport actually can occur here. You're going to pump out some sodium and chloride ions, which is going to move water out of the tubule and start to make urine more concentrated. You don't want to let go of too much water in your urine. And water movement out of that loop helps concentrate the tubular fluid as the fluid moves through here. Next up, the distal convoluted tubule, the DCT, which is here and here in kind of this salmon pinkish color. It differs from the PCT that was in kind of this purplish because of a small diameter, smaller than the PCT, and lack of microvilli. You actually would find some microvilli associated with that cuboidal epithelial layer. And so what does the DCT do? It's important for three basic processes. It will actively secrete ions, acids, drugs, and toxins. So your kidneys are actually helping out with, getting rid of drugs and toxins. The liver, of course, plays a big part in that too. But your kidneys are going to help with this. That's great. Selective reabsorption of sodium and calcium ions based on your needs. Depending on your calcium, sodium levels in your blood, that's going to determine how selective that absorption is, and selectively absorbs water. So it's just finalizing what's going to become urine. How much stuff you're going to let go of, how much stuff you're going to hang on to. Finally, it's the collecting system. So we've already talked about this renal corpuscle, the glomerulus, and the Bowman's capsule. Here's that PCT, the loop of Henle, the DCT, and then you finally get to what's called the collecting system. So there is some final filtration that happens here, secretion and reabsorption. I'm going to talk more about what these terms specifically mean on the next slide. But now, concentrated urine passes through the collecting duct, this purple region, which merges into papillary ducts. So the papillary ducts get all the different collections, the urine collected from the different nephrons in this region, and finally empty into what's called the minor calyx, which I mentioned before. The minor calyxes lead to these major calyxes, these kind of hallways that lead urine into the renal pelvis, and finally out into the ureters. All right, so summary of urine formation. 3 terms that you need to keep in mind. 3 basic processes, and the first one is filtration. Filtration. That's mainly what's going on with the glomerulus, that collection of capillaries, and the Bowman's capsule. So blood pressure forces water and some other solutes into the Bowman's capsule to start it off. So that's the initial filtration from out of your blood. Then reabsorption. reabsorption is getting the stuff that you want to hang on to out of that tube so that it doesn't escape through your urine. So water and solute are removed from the tubule, the PCT, etc., and go into the paratubular fluid outside of those tubes. Important fluids and nutrients are reabsorbed into the blood through active transport and osmosis. So as blood leaves the kidney, that stuff is not going to escape through your urine. And secretion. Solutes are transported from the paratubular fluid back into the tubule. That's the final chance to get stuff that you do want to get rid of out of that paratubular fluid where stuff's been reabsorbed, and it can go back into that distal part of the tubule and then into the collecting system. This is necessary to do because filtration alone is not enough to get unwanted wastes out of the plasma. So if we didn't have the secretory ability, the amount of wastes we get rid of every time we urinate would not be sufficient to maintain homeostasis.